So let's talk a little bit about report writing. The reason that I'm going into report writing in quite so much depth today is, one, forensic report writing is much different than therapeutic report writing. We've already established that. And two, like every single one of my other classes has begged for a lot of information on report writing. I'm not really sure, but all of my evaluations have asked for discussion of report writing, so here goes. When we're writing forensic reports, we're going to keep a number of different things in mind. But I'm going to go through how to write a forensic report step by step. Remember, this is an intro class for those of you guys who teach. In your heading, if the case is referred from the courts, you could write it in a letter style, meaning that you always have your letterhead at the top, but the first thing that you do is say, "Dear," or "Your Honor, so-and-so." And refer to the specific referring judge and write it as a letter. And then your salutations will be there in your closing. But the next thing that's in your packet is an actual report. It's a report template. And the reason that I included this is so that you guys will have something to follow along with as we talk of today, but also so if you want to use any or all parts of this, you certainly can. This is not written with this style, which it would include the referral from the course. It's just regular headings. When in doubt, just use your regular heading, which would be the name and social security number and everything at the top. Next, as informed consent or assent. So you always want a statement in there about effective communication and consent and what are the limits of confidentiality, and you want to spell it out that you said something like that in there, right? So I've got it broken down into two sections. The first is Mr. Doe was informed as to the nature and purpose of this testing and was informed that the results would be summarized in a report that would become part of his X records, or that would be sent to Judge so-and-so, or that would be sent to his attorney, or whatever. Mr. Doe indicated they understood the limits of confidentiality by what? You should actually put what he said. You could just say by articulating what confidentiality meant, or by saying, "Oh, I understand this is going to go to Judge so-and-so," or "I understand this isn't just between you and me," or "I know that everyone's going to be reading this," whatever he says. As many quotes as you can use, the better. Also, if he doesn't sign a consent form because you don't need it because it was referred from the courts, you do want to talk about assent. He assented to the testing. Which means they didn't necessarily sign the confidentiality form, but he did agree to do it. When you are working with children, children assent to the evaluation. Their parents consent to the evaluation. When you are working with someone who's under conservatorship or guardianship, the guardian consents to the evaluation. The person you're evaluating assents to it, right? So you understand the differences. Make sure you note that and put it in there. Put it in your report what happened. Effective communication, you always want to note what you did to establish effective communication. If this person is English as second language and you're speaking in that language, that's great. If you're using an interpreter, I never use an interpreter, ever. I'm not going to be doing evaluations and hoping that someone is interpreting what I say. If I don't speak the language that the person speaks and we can't communicate, I refer them out, just so you know. But if you choose to use an interpreter, you need to put it in there. That's what you did to facilitate effective communication. You also need to note anything else that you did. Like if the person's hard of hearing, you made sure you spoke louder, clearer, use simple language, et cetera, right? So. Confidentiality notice, this is just something that I took from the CDCR. If you have a different one, there's a whole bunch of them out there. This talks about electronic communications. I actually have it at the bottom of every one of my pages as a footer. I just think it's something good to have. Sources of information. Always provide in neat bullets. I've read them that are just kind of one long paragraph. It just looks not as good to me, but that's stylistic. But make sure that you list everything. It's important to make sure that the information, to make sure that the attorney knows that you need information. You need those records. You need those medical records or court records or whatnot. Work with the attorney, make them get you those records or do the legwork yourself. But make sure that you list everything that was available. And then if something isn't available but you requested it, make sure you list that too. Napa State Hospital records were requested but unavailable for the preparation of this report. There, you've just covered yourself. And also, if you don't get those crucial records, in the caveat in your conclusions might be that your opinion might change with more collateral information. And then I don't have to go through all of this. You guys know how to do all of these different social history sections. Hopefully you know how to do a good clinical interview. But I want you to pay attention to a couple of different things. You must include your reasoned argument for an opinion and rule out alternative hypotheses, right? Always keep that in mind. Clearly state the question. What is the referral question? That's going to be on page 1, the very first page. You're going to be talking about what the referral question is for this person from the actual source. 2, their current legal status. Are they currently incarcerated? Are they currently out on probation or parole? I don't have to ask you guys. You guys know the difference between probation and parole, right? You'd be surprised. Many of my colleagues at San Quentin today use them interchangeably. I kid you not. So for those of you who aren't nodding your heads, probation refers to jail, parole refers to prison. But yeah, there are some staff psychologists that use them interchangeably. Sources of information used, we've already talked about. Pertinent social history, I'm not talking about because you guys hopefully know all of those. I choose to use sections for my background history. I break it down into developmental history, education history, employment, medical, mental health, substance abuse. You can delete any of these. You can add to them. A lot of people always like to put a statement about military history. That's fine too. In forensic report writing, I have always seen it like this, broken down into sections to make it easier for the judge or jury or whoever to reference. In clinical reports, I've often seen a narrative style of like 2 or 3 pages of just like prose about the person's life. I have found it as a forensic writer to have it broken down into different sections to be a lot easier for people to go directly to reference, look up just substance abuse if that's all the attorney or whoever's interested in, then have to read through 3 pages of narrative and talk about like this person was abused and they started using and then they went back with their mom and they were abused and then they started using more, and that's a very clinical way of writing, whereas a very forensic way of writing is sections and to the point. And as a forensic report writer, you have to be very unbiased. So you can't write as an advocate. Now, unless you're hired to be an advocate. Now that's a little separate. If you're being hired to do an assessment, say for personal injury, and you're wanting to make a lot of money and you want to get this guy a lot of money, okay, you can write that way. But you might be dinged for being too empathetic. Discussion section that brings everything together. Some people keep this, some people don't, under test results, after your test results section. I've seen it both ways. And by the way, this Milton book, Hellbrun's, all of them have sample reports in the back, if you want to reference some sample reports. I usually don't have a discussion section. I just keep everything in kind of my summary section. But it's really just kind of up to you if you want it separate, because sometimes in forensic report writing, some people like the discussion section, which would bring everything together and make a kind of picture of the person. But in the summary, they just address the question that was asked. Is this person competent to stand trial? 1 paragraph, boom. And that way the judge or jury doesn't have to read through all of your narrative of who the person was and how you arrived at that conclusion. They just read the summary and that was your conclusion. I like to combine it all into one section though. And one thing I don't have up there is under conclusions and recommendations, I will often put bulleted recommendations if it's not answering a specific question. So what I mean by that is if it's more of a therapeutic / forensic report, which is what I do at San Quentin, I will put a whole slew of recommendations for the person. Like the person will do better in a single cell, or the person will do better in a double cell as opposed to dorm living. Person may decompensate under dorm living. Person will need prompts. Person should be Clark tested, if you know what that means. If you don't worry about it. The person should be conserved upon release, you know, and have a guardian. I might put specific recommendations to help guide whoever reads the report next, because what I found is oftentimes if a judge gets a hold of that report, they will rule all of those recommendations in. So they might write into, you know, conditions of the parole or conditions of probation or, you know, conditions of this person being alive, that they need to have these different things. Group home if they're on the outside, that sort of thing. That's why I like bulleted recommendations, because that way someone could look at those and say, I'm going to put these into action. And I've got lists and lists of recommendation depending on, you know, where they're going. If you ever want to write for them, I can send them to you. So you always want to use objective measures. Any kind of objective measure you can get your hands on now. One thing I didn't put up there either is you always want a data sheet. You know, it's interesting. Many of my colleagues that have just started doing testing on my team have never even heard of a data sheet. And I don't know if this is strictly from my neuropsych training or not. It is a separate sheet. It's the last page that may or may not be included in the report. If the report is going to a judge, I do not include this last sheet. If this report is going to another psychologist, I do. This last sheet includes all of my raw data for all of the tests that I did. And it's an optional sheet. And it's not something that I send to a layperson or a person who doesn't have a psychological background because they can't read it. What do they know from T-scores and Z-scores and stay-nines and whatnot? But if it's going to another psychologist, I want them to know how I arrived at my conclusion. All right? So that's why I suggest for every report that you do for testing, if you include a lot of testing, do a separate data sheet just so you can reference it later, because if you get this requested 10 years from now from another psychologist, you can then include it, but you might just have it for your own reference later. Plus, you can put that in your little binder if you ever testify and just talk from that, and no one will actually know what you're talking about. Anyway, so objective measures. You want to avoid reliance on any single test. Never hang your hat on a test. You're always going to want to include several tests, in addition to several areas of information. But just because, say, the MMPI has an elevated ELF scale, that doesn't mean you're going to say, guy's lying. You know, he's exaggerating all of his symptoms. You can't do that. Well, you can, but it's highly inadvisable. My suggestion is to use repeated measures and several different tests that inform and give you the same information on several tests. Because if you give a different test that says something else, then you have to look at level of effort, consistency of effort, and any number of different things. So also, on all objective measures, you have to be trained. If you've received no training in the brand new MENT test, which I'm going to be talking about later, which I'm incredibly excited about. It's the Morale Emotional Numbing Test. How many of you have heard of the Morale Emotional Numbing Test? Very few of you, because it's almost brand new. It's actually malingering test for PTSD. We'll get to that later. But you have to have adequate training in the tests that you use. Now, every single one of you, almost, are psychologists. You have had basic training in psych testing, all right? You should be able to pick up a test, read through it, and be able to administer it. My suggestion is, if it's possibly going to court, and this is the first or second time you're using this test, work with a consultant that has used the test before, or the test designer. Dr. Morrell, very sweet guy, and you could totally talk to him, very open and receptive to discussion, to make sure that you're using it correctly. That way, if you are called to court, and it is found out that this is the first or second time you've ever used this objective measure, you can say, yes, but I have worked with X person to make sure that the validity is intact, right? Use only reliable and valid measures. You don't want to use a measure that no one's ever heard of. Why? Something that's generally accepted, something that's accepted by our peers. If it's Dr. Dempsey's, emotional numbing test, not valid or reliable. It's not something that's been heard of before. It's something that Dempsey just thought up. And all right, we probably want to be able to quote some studies that talk about its reliability and validity. Be aware of the limitations of all of your instruments. You want to make sure that all of your instruments, every instrument that you're going to use has strengths and weaknesses to it. You need to be aware of the weaknesses of your test, because if you're not, but the other attorney is, you're going to be made to look like a fool. So if you are asked, Dr. So-and-so, what is the limitation of this test, or did you know that this test is not valid for use with people with learning disabilities, you will be able to talk about that and the studies that discuss the limitations. Do not use outdated instruments. My goodness. All right, so here's the other day. I get records. It's like Christmas at San Quentin when I'm actually able to obtain records. I know you guys don't feel my pain, but it's very difficult to obtain records sometimes. But the other day, I received a 2010 SSI evaluation from the outside. The analyst sent it to me, and I'm just like jumping for joy, because now I have this data that I can compare, and it was a couple of years ago, and the person was using the MMPI 1. And the WACE R, and the Rorschach without the Exner system. I kid you not. I kid you not. Qualitative look at the Rorschach cards. And even though he got 16, 17 responses, he said something to the effect of, even though the client denied any history of sexual abuse, on cards 2 and 4, he saw human anatomy, which suggests that he may have been abused as a child. Yeah, it then became something that I used with my students as what not to do. But obviously, using outdated instruments, outdated theory, I can only see how grizzled this old therapist must have been. But if this guy was called into court, he would be shredded. And he might even lose his license. This research shows, newest research, that the Rorschach can be valid with forensic population for reality testing only. So, I do use the Rorschach for reality testing only with a slew of other tests. So for instance, if I had, and I've had several malingering evaluations that I'm looking at the guy and he's like right on the edge. I'm like, I don't know if this guy's malingering or not. I give him the Rorschach and it shows that he's a wackadoo. Then I know that, okay, he's got some thought disturbances, and that, taken into consideration with him being on the cusp of weirdness for other tests, kind of supports what I'm saying, plus all of the collateral information that I bring together. Yeah, well, I'm really fast at scoring it because I've memorized all the scales and all of the tables. So I've already got it all in my brain. And then I run it through the Exner system, so it does all the math for me because I hate math. So It's not that long. It doesn't take that long for me. Now I can see a lot of people, especially people who are OCD and have memorized all of the charts, because I was a TA too, and having to go through all of the charts for all of the different students really helps solidify that. I could see where it would take a long time. I like it. I like it for that one thing, and that's all I like it for. Also, FYI, the RPass is the new Exner. You guys all know Exner died? Exner died, and his family inherited the Exner system of scoring. And they have done nothing with it. But Erdberg and his group have taken the Exner system of scoring, because they were working with Exner with it, and have created the RPass. So if you are interested in learning more about the new system of scoring that in the next 5 years will exceed Exner, there are trainings out there, and you can look that up. Don't use outdated instruments, and use only relevant tests. When I say use only relevant tests, I mean don't use tests that measure other things. Would you ever use an MMPI to look at violence risk? No. The answer is no. The MMPI does not predict violence risk. The MMPI does look at different factors that might go into violence risk, but you would use a violence risk instrument, a forensically relevant instrument, to look at violence risk. All right. You wouldn't necessarily look at, I had someone say they use the rat for diagnosing learning disabilities. Would you ever use the rat to look at diagnosing learning disabilities? No, you would use a more thorough assessment of the WIAT plus the WIMS plus the WISC or the WACE or whatnot. You would look at a number of different things. You wouldn't look at a screening instrument. So just be aware of using relevant tests and using the tests that measure the things that you're looking for. And don't hang your hat on only one test. Forensic assessment triad, observations and data and collateral information. This is what you're using to arrive at your conclusions, right? Always pay attention to everything that you're observing, the data from your tests, and your collateral information. It's like a tripod. Without one of the legs, you fall over. So you need all three of these in every one of the reports that you do. Report writing continued. Make it easy to understand. Again, avoid use of jargon in testimony and report writing. Akaesthesia. Who knows what that means? I had to look it up. I felt so dumb. In a progress note, one of our young psychiatrists, who I love to death, he's brilliant, and he shows it in his writing. Uses all these big words, and I'm just like, really, guy? So I have to go and look it up. Akaesthesia, what some of you guys are doing today, not being able to sit still in your chair. Say again?
Interstate restlessness.
Inner restlessness, thank you. It's a restlessness, or it could be seen with restless leg syndrome. So the guy I'm testing now has restless leg syndrome. He's been diagnosed with it, and his psychiatrist says he's demonstrating akaesthesia, and then goes on, and I'm like, akaesthesia, what is that? And I look it up, I'm like, I knew that. Anyway, don't put that in your reports, because I can assure you, the judge has no patience for that. The judge isn't going to go and look up akaesthesia. They're just going to say, this is a guy who uses way too big words and makes me feel stupid, and I automatically don't like him. I always tell my students, write for the person at Starbucks. Can the barista understand what you wrote? If your answer is no, then you've just insulted someone on the jury, because the jury is made up of baristas. So, least common denominator, write it in lay terms, avoid jargon, make it easy to read, right? Now, that doesn't mean you have to dumb it down, and it doesn't mean that you have to compromise your own writing style. It just means that you need to make it readable. Right? Read it from the opposing counsel's point of view. One of the things that I've told my students in my forensic assessment class that made everyone groan is go back through your entire report backwards. Read each sentence. backwards. Have I ever done this? No. But it's something that I heard once, and I thought, that's a really cool idea. So if you're ever in doubt, or if you ever think it might be going to court, I might actually do this, read it backwards and make sure that every single sentence is understandable unto itself, and can it be argued in court. Avoid extreme adjectives, very, never, etc. This guy was very stupid. No, he was very he had large amounts of akathisia. The reason why is because extremes takes away from your objectivity. It looks like you are a little bit more biased than you probably are. Now, that said, if you want to hang someone, or if you want to save someone, you can use judicious adjectives, or judicious use of adjectives, rather. You can say he was very remorseful, and then describe what that means. If you want to, add a little oomph. But I have read so many reports where people are using extremes just as the course of writing. It's like prose, and it's very indicative of a clinical writing style, not a forensic writing style. So as you read and as you write, make sure that your writing it shows you as very unbiased. And the fact is that you will help your clients best if you are not biased. If you come across as scientific and professional, and your conclusion is this person is not guilty, or is guilty by reason of insanity, then you will probably do better by your client. Avoid, I like nails on a chalkboard when I read that someone's suffering. She suffered from child abuse. That's judgmental. So try and be not judgmental, meaning that how do you know a person suffered from child abuse? Did they say that? If they did, put it in quotes. Use their quotes to describe what they say. But if you just say he suffered from child abuse, then it suggests that you're inferring that he's suffering, and the opposing attorney can say, Dr. Dempsey, how do you know this person was suffering? Does everyone suffer if they were abused as a child? How are you going to answer that? And use as many direct quotes as you possibly can. Another thing that took me a long time to get used to, like 2 months in my internship, and then I got over it, was he reported records indicate. He reported records indicate. That should be in pretty much every sentence, every other sentence. Otherwise, it sounds like you're saying something. Mr. Jones was born and raised in California. He grew up with 6 siblings, and he was abused as a child. Where did you get that information, doctor? Did you make that up? But if you preface it with, Mr. Jones reported that, then you've covered yourself. And another thing is just typographical. When someone says something, it immediately becomes past tense. What I just said, it's gone now. Records are always present tense. Test data is always present tense. So a record will always indicate something. Because 10 years from now, when you read that record, it still indicates something. In any case, you don't necessarily have to worry about that. If you have to use technical terms, because sometimes we have to talk about technical terms, then explain them, right? You could say akathisia if you really, really need to, put in parentheses what that means. Then the person has just learned something and they feel smart. Use sections, that's my thing. Avoid legal terms. You're not the attorney, you're the clinician, so don't talk about legal terms unless it's directly from the referral source. Show your reasoning process. Opinions are based on findings. In forensic report writing, you're always going to be cushioning things. You're always going to be cushioning things from, your test data and from what you have. You're not going to be making large inferences. You can always talk about based on clinical opinion, but you don't necessarily need to just say off the bat, he's insane, or he's, in fact, never use insane because that's a legal term. And then maintain objectivity throughout all of your testing. I use single spaces in all the reports that I write. I have once talked to an attorney who said that he requests space and a half for easier reading. Use whatever format your attorney says to use. I always default back to single space. Well edited. I've talked to a number of different forensic psychologists that say they always have someone read their reports for them before they send it out. Their secretary, their spouse, poor spouse, or someone to read through it and make sure it makes sense and look for any typos. Because if it is going to court, you don't want to be, thought up as the idiot who made 30 typos in their report. You want to have it clean. Length is always determined by the question. Now, in the beginning, I had on one of the slides that it's more detailed, and it is. I have heard differing things, and maybe you guys can chime in with what you've heard too for reports. But a lot of people say that they prefer very short reports for forensic evaluations, just answering the questions. Others, 50 to 100-page reports are not uncommon. I read one of my colleagues' reports where he went into every single scale of the MMPI, what it measured, what the validity of it was. I thought that was a little on the major part of overkill, but he was charging per page, so, he's doing something right and I'm not. But, I think that erring on the side of brief but detailed is better. I teach from a perspective of applicability. Wow, I said that right. Meaning, I don't know about you guys, but when I was going through school, I took every assessment course I could possibly get my hello hands on. But I've had teachers that made me write 20-page reports for the WACE, going through every single scale and what it means and et cetera, et cetera. And I thought that was the worst use of my time and energy, because theoretically, if you could read what I wrote and look at a data sheet, you could tell if I did it right or not. It's kind of like being told to show your work in math. You guys remember? And most of you are guys, so you did well in math. Huh? I can be sexist too. Showing your math. My husband's currently in school, and he's doing all these business classes. And that's his main concern, because he's like a lightning calendar. You give him a string of numbers, he does them right away. And he said he keeps on getting dinged for not showing his work, and he feels like he's in high school and he hates it. So that's kind of my thought when I'm writing reports. I don't necessarily need to have to show my work. I don't need to teach the person what the MMPI scales are. All I need to do is summarize them for the person, and if I am called to justify my interpretation of those scales, I can do that. Okay. So I agree with you guys, less than 20, less than 7, depending on where it's going. Okay. If you decide, or dictate, if you dictate, coming back to the translator question, make sure that you read the final product thoroughly, because it's your work. So I never use a dictation service. A lot of people do use dictation services and transcriber services. I don't. I'm a little bit of a control freak. All right, so funny thing there. The new APA style guidelines say you can use 1 or 2 spaces after every sentence. That the only importance is consistency. I'm a 2-space girl. Okay. I think it's old school, but all right. So avoid any inflammatory statements that are irrelevant. It comes back to suffering. What about to diagnose or not to diagnose? That is the question. If the referral question is this guy competent to stand trial, are you going to diagnose? Not necessarily. Maybe. You know, you might say he's not competent to stand trial because he's got schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is too, psychotic symptoms are too problematic, etc. Personal injury, maybe not. You know, if there's no mental health, if he's a personal injury, borderline personality disorder, but was injured. You're working for the defense. Are you going to put borderline personality disorder in? Probably not. Why? Because it doesn't really add to the report, and it might detract from the report. I give access to all the time. All the time. Because I love access to, I don't know. I actually love giving feedback to people about their access to. And maybe it's because the setting that I work in, it's just so easy. You know, we've got a lot of, like antisocial, you spit and you hit one. But the way I describe access to, and everyone I've ever given feedback to totally accepts this. I say, we all have a wall around us that keeps us safe. That wall came from our childhood and the lessons that we learned in our childhood. Sometimes, brick by brick, as we build our wall, that wall becomes really, really rigid. And oftentimes, when I'm talking to a person with antisocial or narcissistic or whatnot, I say, for you, you experienced a lot of stuff in your childhood that forces you to want to keep people at an arm's length. And at that point, I've got buy-in, because most people are able to hear that, because that's where personality disorders come from. And then I can talk about the nuances of the personality disorder and how that continues to get them in trouble. And so when I'm putting it into a report, I will describe the personality disorder as a defense and how it has contributed to behavior that has perpetuated the problem. You don't necessarily need to get into the nuances of different things. In the same way as you don't have to go into a lot of detail, and I've seen this in the reports too, about a person's childhood abuse. I have seen people, especially therapeutic evaluations, go into 2 pages of how the person was sexually abused by their aunt, and then their cousin, and then their father, and how they were physically abused by this and between these ages. I really just put one sentence. Mr. Jones reported that he was sexually abused between the ages of 5 and 7. Boom. That's all I need to put. I don't need to go into a lot of detail about it because it's not relevant. And yeah, he was just saying that it's a matter of putting in the truth, but not necessarily all of the truth, and leaving out the irrelevant stuff that doesn't add to your report. So I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind. So to diagnose or not to diagnose, it's really stylistic. It really does come down to answering the question. And as I said at the beginning, you always have to keep what is the question and keep that in mind. But what's the most important thing to keep in mind? The deadline. That's right. You have to keep the deadline in mind. In forensic report writing, it's one of the most important things that you have to keep in mind, because the deadline is what kind of dictates how many times you get to see the person. You know, it dictates a lot. If you have a 2-week deadline, can you see this guy 4 times over the next 2 weeks? Maybe, but more likely than not, you're going to be only able to see him once or twice, and you have to get that report done. Right? And you always want to get it in before the deadline, because if you consistently get it in by midnight of the deadline, that's not really going to get you much in the way of repeat business. But if you're consistently Johnny on the spot, getting things in early, you're going to be seen as much more professional.